You, I work. Dear colleagues, please look at this woman in the Presidium. Lena, tell us, what is the name of it? Well, it turns out that we found out that they also were awarded those medals and orders and just not wearing them. I received it today, and I must say I'm very happy. When last year I was awarded Gaidar Prize, I repeated a phrase that was once was written in her Facebook by Ira Yesene. She wrote about all international awards and orders. She says, twice the hero of the non-Soviet Union. Now I'm also, I have the prize named after Gaidar, so I'm also having relation to the Polish delegation will translate it. It's also called Cavalier's Cross. It also says for establishing civic relations between Russia and Poland. And this is true, and I'm very proud. And this is a good order. Please take a look. Tomorrow we shall put it into the box, but today you can see, let everybody admire it. Lena, can we ask you to get up so that anybody could see you and the order in all beauty? Well, this is the Polish president wrote me a letter. Well, it's a great pleasure, really. Do you know his name? Whom? The president? Do you? I won't tell you his name. Lena, so now we hope that after this wealth of orders, now the Russian state will show jealousy, and they will increase the fine, you mean? No, not. They will decrease the fine. So I thank you very much. I apologize before all those who spoke in the sessions before that, because indeed I could not attend. I do hope you were all pleased, you liked it, it was interesting, but I honestly apologize before you. It is one and only event. So I very strongly wanted to make earlier but the traffic jam is so bad that I could not. It might be that I might not be on time to attend this session. So this is our traditional session, which is very important for us, a very fundamental importance, matter of principle for us, for the school and for all those students who attend the school. And I'd like to say that both to Arseny and to Sasha, that this is something that you do not know. This is a new class. And the seminar today, they will tell you it all themselves. Sorry, what I want to remind you that we have here the people who created a remarkable organization called the Memorial, which has worked for many areas and even defends today the activity in human rights. They're also human rights activists. But what they are restoring the memory and getting from oblivion the names of people and bring back the memory which stops being nameless, devoid of its name, which gains, and this quantity gains a new name now. And our society in the early 1990s, as I saw it, was ready at that time to accept something and to somehow talk about our past. I do not know what has happened. Probably historians will tell us what it was. But our society turned out to be unable to translate this emotion into simple words such as state crime, and to write it in the textbooks for first graders or sixth graders, I don't know, when they begin to study history. For only this reason, so that the teacher just in a regular school, should not be shy saying that this is exactly the state that put its own nation, its own people under these conditions, and then made them show the worst features of human character. And all the cultures are age-long attempts to go away from what happened within the country. So we'd like the students of this seminar should hear, first of all, the assessment of what took place then, and also should hear about what the memorial does. Because this is the only, basically, organization in this country that is doing the work for the whole nation. The nation will make use of this work. It is never too late, but today they are doing it on their own. They are alone. This is what I want to single out when we see people who set up this memorial society. That's it. Thank you. We, Alexander Yulich and I, we divided our presentation into two parts, but we shall speak not about the topic society and history, although it certainly will be represented in this presentation, but we'll discuss historical policy and historical memory. These are the two topics we shall focus on. I shall mostly focus on the first, and Alexander Yulich will focus mostly on the second topic. We won't try to detain much of your attention, because I feel terribly sorry for you, because you have been around since morning and it's every day. And certainly you must be very tired, but nevertheless, the subject is not that simple, although we'll try to explain it in plain language. We don't want to be very long in our presentations. We hope that in part two we shall speak and we shall take your questions, and I hope that 40 minutes for the two of us. So please bear with us and show patience. So I would like to begin my presentation and start a conversation about historical policy. What is it all about? We don't, either of us, understand what it is, and some 30 years ago this term did not exist at all. Nowadays the world has agreed that in each country there is its historical policy. There are many diverse and various definitions. I'll translate it into the most plain language of all and give you the simplest definition, so that this is something that you should accept easily without some specialist jargon. Historical policy, it's this kind of purposeful effort by the state, and the system of purposeful efforts by the state, which, as a result of which, an image of the past should be created in such a manner that today's country's state, meaning the authority, are happy with. When the authority is this is when they say the state in Russian, they mean basically the authority. What are they doing it? They're doing it first of all to serve their own purposes today. This is what historical policy is about. And what is it manifested in? What are the forms in which it exists? This is all very simple. This is all these, for example, erection of monuments, all kinds of monuments. And you immediately think, to whom are they erecting monuments? And who are those people to whom they do not erect monuments? And this is actually manifestation of historical policy. Memorial plaques. Who gets honored by those memorial plaques and who does not? In whose name it is the names of the streets and everything is given, and whose honor they're not very keen, they're reluctant to give their name to. And, or for example, what are the memorial days sort of are commemorated by the state? What new memorial commemorative dates are introduced, and which commemorative dates are not celebrated? It's quite certain that The highest point of historical policy is manifested in school textbooks. This is where they purposefully set up a certain image of the past, which veterans are supported by these authorities and which are not. Which laws are adopted, for that matter, in historical topics, if they are at all adopted, and which institutions are created and which are not accepted, or not created, or not adopted, or say state programs. When we try to cover it all, there's a complete scale to draw it from left to right, and to the right write the facts about, I do not really know what to say our own Russian or any other history of any other country. You would understand that there is certainly a system about it all, and this system in its totality represents the historical policy. This is the creation of the past that today's authorities are happy with. Let's look at it from the perspective of what the memorial do. This is what Elena Mikhailовna mentioned in her presentation just a couple of minutes ago. This is through the perspective of state and political terror. State political terror, or political terror by the state. If we look at the Soviet political terror, then its scale is not that mythological which we hear of, but it's still immense, immense. We have in Russia a law about rehabilitation, means rehabilitation politically, but it is pretty much narrow in its treating who would suit the notion of being acknowledged as and recognized as the victim of political terror. So if we look at the former Soviet Union, not at Russia alone, then we, during the history of Soviet power, had direct victims of political terror, approximately 11 to 12 million people. It is not a small figure. Out of these 11 to 12 million people, a million, slightly over a million, I do not want to dwell upon statistics of the terror, where I'm actually a specialist to certain. May I give you the most general notions of this scale, sort of slightly over a million, 100 million, 200,000 are people who were shot, executed at the verdicts of different judicial and non-judicial orders. And about another 4 million people were sent to gulag camps. And another, again, it's 4.5 maybe, and say 6 million and something were people who, in general, were not tried on their individual accusation, but they were tried what they call summary trial, and they were deported in labor camps. They were forcibly evicted from where they stayed and were sent somewhere, usually to the north or to Siberia, to Kazakhstan, and settling with their families. A classical example of these last category would be mass deportations of people from Eastern Poland, which later was called in this country, what did we call it? Western Ukraine and Western Belarus in 1940, 1941, and from the Baltic republics. They were also, again, the countries that were taken in 1940. It's about 400,000 people, approximately. These are mass deportations of nations, of peoples in 1943, 1944. And this is mass deportation. There are hundreds of thousands and millions of people, and so on and so forth. These people are slightly over 6 million. All in all, we have a figure, an immense figure, as you can see, 11.5 approximately, maybe almost 12 million for sure. And this is where you cannot forget that the victims of political reprisals also include people, over 5 million people, who were deprived of election rights immediately after the revolution in the first 20 years of the Soviet rule. They were called lishenцы, means that they were deprived of their rights. That was reflected in the first Russian constitution of 1918, and that was restored only back in 1956. So, 36, sorry. So over 5 million people, they were not just deprived of rights, it had certain other implications. Or, for example, to the question which categories again should belong here or may belong here. Or, for example, those who died from artificially induced hunger of 1932-33, and you probably know the scale of that famine is at the minimum 6 million people. Over half in the Ukraine. It was certainly artificially induced, and that leaves no doubt. The scale of the terror is huge. How could this event, this terror, how could this terror function? I'm not speaking about a memory, it's a separate story. In the historical policy of the state, this grandiose event, which was accompanying us during all the years of Soviet rule, and which to a great extent influenced and shaped our Soviet, Russian, which are hard to distinguish, these two notions here, mentalities, with all the reflections and fears. And so this immense event, how is it reflected in historical policy? Let us follow that historical scale, remember, which I mentioned when I shall describe its parameters. Let me begin with the simplest, say, support of the veterans of Gulag. Do you know which amount under our law was paid as a compensation to former prisoners of the camps? Do you have a slightest idea about that? Let me tell you. Former prisoners of the camps, according to the law that is still in effect and has not yet been amended. It was adopted in 1991 when the country was impoverished. The law said the following: those who were exiled and got into labor camps where the conditions were very much like in Gulag, they don't qualify for anything, no compensation whatsoever. Those who served time in camps and prisons, they qualify for, at that time it was a slightly smaller amount, I'll tell you which amount is nowadays, 100 rubles per month for each month they spent in prison. So you can imagine that a person who served, say, 5 years in the river Kolyma, this is 60 months. In some way, he survived by miracle. Then he gets this sort of material compensation from the state, multiplied by 100. I don't feel comfortable even speaking about it. For that matter, we appealed to the Constitutional Court, some papers, and the Constitutional Court said, indeed, the law, when it was adopted, it said, well, as we can, gradually the state is now in such a situation. There was some kind of excuse that they found. I'm now speaking about the verdict of the Constitutional Court, but now we are in a different situation, and the recommendation to the Supreme Council was so that they should amend these sums. Be my guest and guess whether they changed it or not. Surely they haven't amended it. Are these people, are we calling streets of our citizen towns in honor of those victims? No, we're not. Are we hanging memorial plaques to honor them? No, they're not. And if they do, there are some memorial plaques, then they're sort of very modest. For example, in Moscow, come to this famous house on the embankment that Trifonov dedicated his novel to. It will say, this is the house where Marshal Tukhachevsky lived. That's it. It won't say how he finished his life. the interpreter here begs to differ. And you will say that the great director of Всеволод Meyerhold lived here, but it won't say. Like both Marshal Tukhachevsky and director Meyerhold, several years after him, was executed too. So these words we are ashamed like to mention. If in some very famous people, if they even would decide to erect these memorial plaques, but they will never mention what the state did to them. This house is where Sergei Pavlovich Korolev lived. Great spaceship builder, yes, but this is the house exactly where he was arrested and taken to Gulag. And you probably know there is an excellent writer, prose writer, who wrote in great books, Kalimsky Рассказы, Varlam Shalamov, you know him, right? Last year, it was the first year that our Moscow history, I'm speaking about Moscow, they erected this memorial plaque to Shalamov, but he is one of the top, he was translated in all the languages, but it was through great battle and under my personal responsibility of a great admirer of Shalamov, one of deputies of today's mayor of Moscow. They put in a phrase, this is where between two, it didn't use the name like served time, but it was between two arrests. This is the house where Shalamov lived between his two arrests. But until very recently they tried to delete it and say, let's put it like writer Shalamov lived here. Oh, this is where famous writer Shalamov lived. Do you want more text? This is where a very famous writer Shalamov lived. And so on. So they just sought to avoid those words altogether. So you can imagine that, say, that the main memorial in Moscow, that was in stone, enshrined in stone, the simple stone in Lubyanka Square that was brought from Solovki Island, Solovki stone, in 1990. That's it, since 1990. They haven't found any chance to, or any possibility to. Do we have many museums dedicated to Gulag? I don't want to mention it. Look, just try to remember, you've traveled from all across Russia, you know that it doesn't exist at all. Moreover, I would put it this way. The only museum, the camp that serves as a museum near Perm 36, that was created and set up by society through public effort, because of and through much effort paid by the state, it's now removed, and they will create some state-owned museum with some very different concept, because the consultants in setting up this new museum were mostly, they thought they should be former people who worked for the camp administration. Think of it. Think of it. Although those people are still alive, and many people are still alive who served time in that camp, because this is where dissidents stayed, and it created until 1988. There are quite a lot of famous people, not really famous, but who became known, and they're still alive with us. But somehow it doesn't satisfy them. They say, what is it, you know? And the society that was set up, it is being pushed away, and this territory is seized by the state, and they will set up something very different there. So when I am telling you this story, if we can look it up through it all, you know, along these lines, you will understand that in the state historical policy, which certainly exists, because, you know, because of monuments are being erected, memorial plaques are being placed, and quite logically and consistently, our president today, remember the time when he was still prime minister, the first thing he did was erect a memorial plaque to Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov. Well, it's a controversial step, but that was his position. But nevertheless, we opened a memorial plaque to Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, set up a memorial plaque to the secretary of Leningrad committee, or Georgy Vasilievich Romanov, and so on and so forth. These are the people who get glorified through memorial plaques and who are being actively, I would tell you how much effort it takes to, and really what battles we had to go through to put in a memorial plaque to Shalamov. So does this historic policy by the state exist towards the topic of terror? Yes, it does. It's certainly based upon common historical concept, which is very simple, but it should probably be simple, which is every day being broadcast into our heads, every day, from the top. The concept is endlessly simple, and it is such. We, Russia, we are a great country. We are the best. What's wrong with that? And we have always been the best. And we have always only did good to these people, to all the peoples, but for some reason, sometimes they pay with ingratitude.
Perhaps that's a problem that will be on their conscience, but us, we always bringing virtue to those peoples, and we have always been surrounded by enemies who wanted to do us something bad, either to conquer us or to take some benefits and advantages, as it is fashionable now to put us on our knees. But we always managed to destroy those enemies. And inside the country, we always had fifth column supporters of those enemies. It has been and it is in our country since we are faced with enemies. So we destroy both enemies and the fifth column, and we move from victory to victory. And it's all our victories, and Dnepr gas hydraulic power plant and bomb railroad as our victory. It's true that Russian people enjoyed the greatest victories. Perhaps my colleague will tell you about them, and it's certainly our victory in World War II, and conquering of space was our victory, as well as the Crimea now. And I don't know what will happen next. So all the time we've been moving as a country from victory to victory, and Mr. Putin once put it like this. The country of victors, and we used to have very glorious history, and we are having a glorious history, which is going to be even more glorious, and but based on glorious history concept, we cannot switch to the topic I mentioned before. What's the difference between the position of the memorial and the position of the power? The main difference is that the power creates that black and white image based on the concept of glorious history. While we say it's true that in our history one can find a lot of glorious things, but there was an equal number of shameful events and criminal events, and we are really responsible for memorizing and remembering all those events, shameful events. A human being is a complex creature, and only being complex, a person can learn from both good and bad lessons, and that's the only prerequisite for the history not to repeat. But historical policy runs counter to us, and us, the memorial, are disguised as bad guys, telling only bad things about the country. That's a very simple construct concerning the historical policy and us. And having said that, I'm going to turn the floor to a friend of mine, who is Alexander Engel. You know, I hate repeating things, but in this room, I think I didn't meet with you, but I spoke, I was invited and spoke here at the school for a number of times, and I've been always singing just one song. And I'm going to sing that song once again, but I'll focus only on the one theme. And Arseny has already identified that theme. That's the memory of terror versus the memory of war. And since my role here is not to speak about historical policy, but about historical memory, I'm going to dwell on massive stereotypes. It's not about what power and authorities are doing, but it's about what I think eligible people think, or conventional people think. And at the end, I'll try to entertain the question that Lena posed to us, meaning what happened to our national conscience starting from the end of 1980s, when the motivos tell us all these stories about terror, and it gathered rallies numbering dozens of thousands of people. And nowadays, or till early 2000, when for the majority of the people that topic lost any significance. And today, when this particular theme and topic is revised by many people. So it's true that Arseny has already identified the main collision, that's the conflict between the memory of terror and memory of war. But what does that conflict look like? If the state terror was a crime, then who were the criminals? The state? Stalin, who was at the head of the state. But we defeated Nazism. And Nazism was the absolute evil. So that means that the regime that defeated Nazism could not be a criminal. The regime that defeated the absolute evil. And the subjects of that regime cannot be criminals. On the contrary, we are a great country. We embodied all the good that one can find in the world. And it was under the leadership of Stalin that we defeated Hitler. The victory is the epoch of Stalin, as well as the terror. So how we can match the two images of the past? It looks like it's next to impossible. But to understand what's really going on now, I think we should be frank to ourselves. And because that, equation, war and terror, is a fake. It is a fake because, and it's a man-made fake, since it results from what is called historical policy. That's the purposeful efforts of the power. And the matter is, and further on I'm going to say some things contrary to the memorial purposes, and I will focus on the memory of war things. Well, the trick is that the memory of war that is actually designed, that has been designed by the state for some 50 years, it's not a real memory of war. As a matter of fact, that's the memory of just one day of war, and that is, well, I understand that you all can guess I am meaning 9th of May, Day of Victory of 1945. But it's not what I'm thinking of. If you read some memoirs and remembrances, and there are some references to the Victory Day, the May 9th, you might have memorized that that was the day of the uncontrolled eruption of emotions on the part of the people. It was the joyful emotions coming from the bottom, and that was the happiness, not about even the victory, but about the fact that peace had finally came. And today, it's not the real picture of 9th of May 1945 that is being redesigned. What is redesigned is the picture related to another day. That's 24th of July of 1945. That's the day of the parade on the Red Square, when we always saw brave guards who were throwing Nazis' banners and flags with swastikas to the feet of Generalissimus Stalin. So that's the picture, that's the main symbol of today's redesigned memory of war. The one that is being introduced to us quite actively and purposefully. But we should really be decent saying that it's not just the fact that it's being introduced very actively, but it is the fact that it's the picture of a happy day, but not the picture of tragic events that are required by the people. And overall, speaking of some deficiencies in the public memory, you should always be cautious about this statement that those deficiencies results from some evil schemes of some officials or leaders. In some way, political elite just meets the requirements from the people. And the picture that is wanted by the people is offered to them by the power. And the true memory of war, the memory that people had right after the May 9th, 1945, the memory that was not formalized yet, the memory that brought fighters, soldiers back from the fronts, the memory that tens of millions of families who lost their parents, sons, brothers in the war had. It's a tragic memory, it's heroic memory, but it's not heroism at war. It's the heroism of our ability to withstand the invasion. And that's the reason why the memory was really great right after the war. And because the nation managed to turn the greatest defeat of 1941 into a victory of 1945. At terrible costs and unbelievable costs. So, but we won, and that's the memory of tragedy. It's not the memory of victory. It's the memory of how people managed to overcome greatest defeats, and that's the memory that our culture keeps. That's the memory that our literature keeps. And all greatest books on the war by Nekrasov, by Grossman, and by other writers. I can think of many books of the kind, by Adamovich, by Bykov. So they were about the memory of tragedy and not about the brass bands playing victorious songs. And that's the memory. And I'm returning to revisiting the historical policy, but that was the memory that was consistently replaced by another kind of memory. So some 10 or 11 years ago, we saw a very interesting document. It was a list of state-sponsored events prior to 2005, prior to the 60th anniversary of war, of victory rather. It was the list of events to be held to dedicate the 60th anniversary of war. It was a compilation of some pages, about 80 pages, quite thick. And we saw a table on one of the pages. A number of the event, name of the title of the event, dates, persons or agencies responsible for that event. It's a very shocking document, because nearly 80% of the pages of the documents were dedicated to the opening of memorials dedicated to victorious battles and victorious troop leaders who commanded the troops during those battles. Say, a monument to Marshal Zhukov at some place, at another place, a monument to Marshal Talbukhin or Rokossovsky at other places, memorial of the Prokhorov-Kateng battle, and statues of various marshals sitting on horses. And that was the kind of the memorial propaganda that had about 80% of all the pages. Some other 10% of the documents were dedicated to our allies. It happens we had allies, we did have allies, and they also waged the war. It's not just Russia or the Soviet Union who defeated Nazis alone. So it was admitted that there was the Second Front, and D-Day operation in Normandy. So 10% of the document was dedicated to events commemorating our allies, and 5% were about the events dedicated to the hardships of the people during the war, and those events that were dedicated to commemorate fascists' crimes in the occupied territories. And 5% of all the events were dedicated to prisoners of war. And there was no events to commemorate the contribution of the Gulag labor camps into the victory. So that's the way the war looks like in the minds of our state leaders. And so it becomes quite clear that that musical, staged musical, cannot substitute for the true memory of war. That memory was such a shock that it makes it live in most of the families, and it lives in the memories of the families as a tragic event. So I don't think that there are any war veterans who are still alive and who have their personal memories. It's only their sons and grandsons who keep that memory. And some remaining parts of the memory to that victorious picture, which oppose those official picture, and nothing was planned to commemorate the tragic events during the war, to commemorate those tens of millions of dead and wounded, and nothing was to commemorate the fates and destinies of those people who were sucked into that war. And sorry for revisiting some previous points. So in this compilation of pages of events, we saw no memory to say that that was the war against Nazism. So it was not specified that our enemy was not just a country or a state, but it was Nazism. So emphasis was not placed on the fact that it was an anti-fascist war. But coming back to my ongoing points, I can say that historians, decent historians, know that it was a great war of the mankind against Nazism, and it had a tale of a great number of small wars that were also very tragic ones. And very often those small wars continued even after 1945. Those were the wars in the Southeast Asia that followed after Great War II, in Burma, in Vietnam, in Korea, when the Japanese invaders left those countries, and all the way to Europe. Small wars in the Baltic countries, a small war in Western Ukraine. It was also a war. There was also a war in Greece in 1947. So there were multiple of other small wars, and the fates of the people who were engaged in those conflicts and destinies of countries who became satellites of great powers and at war were also very tragic, but they were absolutely discounted. And so the statement is that those events were not worth commemorating. So who fought in Western Ukraine in 1945 through 1950? There were Bandera followers, they were henchmen of the fascists, and if they were fighting against the Red Army, that's the fact. And who was fighting against the Soviet Army in 1944, 1945, again the Soviet Army in the Baltic states? They called them Forest Brothers. But if they fought against us and we were fighting with Nazis, then they were henchmen of fascists. I'm not saying that in Western Ukrainian rebel forces there were no people who had collaborated with Nazis before. I think there were such people, quite a few of them. But you cannot present the history of national resistance to the Soviet occupation the way they saw it. So to think of that just like of the battle between Red Army and Nazis, henchmen, and to think that it lasted for 5 years just because of that will not be true. So it's not just about fascist supporters. It would be a great lie. And you can just see how that lie is working now for the purposes of the current policies. We all witness that. And what is funny about that is the fact that those national liberation movements which started after World War II, say in South Eastern countries, and that resulted from the war with Japan and defeat of Japan. Following that logic, they could also be referred to as supporters of the Japanese, because they had collaborated with the Japanese. But on the contrary, Aung was the head of the country in Burma. Sukarno was the president of Indonesia. But the Soviet Union never claimed that they were henchmen of Japanese militarists. So, but for that end, we have an explanation that by collaborating with the Japanese, they were opposing British imperialists and colonialists. So that's particular theme of tragedies at small wars, the small wars that were doomed for defeat, and hopeless wars. Although those resistant movements consisted of dozens of thousands of people, but they were opposing superpowers, and they resisted for one-on-one. They resisted for some 4 or 5 years, but that's a taboo topic. It's not patriotic, and I think there is also a law, or there is still a draft law. If it is a draft, then I'm not violating that law. I can disappoint you. The law has already been passed on the henchmen of Nazists. So, those black and white stereotypes, as Arseny, a friend of mine, put it, we can see how those stereotypes are working today. 80% of the population here in Russia have no doubts that it's the fascist junta that seized power in Ukraine, because those current Ukrainian leaders, they do not condemn the Ukrainians who fought in the west of the country against the Soviet army. So that's the construct of today's memory. I think my time is nearly up. I'm coming to a close. But I think I still have a chance to say a very important thing. And in fact, from the standpoint of the majority of the people, and I'm not daring say what is primary, what is secondary instinct, people, or some concentrated focus of the elite, but the majority of the people do not understand at all how glory and heroism can be linked to tragedy. And that's the deficiency that stops us from combining the memory of victory and the memory of terror. The Shakespeare's historical chronicles were never condemned, and Shakespeare was not condemned for being anti-patriotic. But to speak of our tragic history, and to say that perhaps it's great because it was tragic, no one can say that, and does not want to say that, either on top or at the bottom. A professor of a high school of economics at a seminar used to say that we cannot tell our kids, school children, the truth about history. Otherwise, they will all start having they will start either having drugs or become immigrants if we tell them the whole truth of our history. We strongly objected to that, and we told him that he told us that probably we don't have to be 100% to tell 100% happy ending stories. Let's choose 5% of the schools or universities where we can say the truth. Others will hear stories about our glorious and happy past. Foreign participants of the seminar were just shocked. They came to me and asked about the political position of that professor. They asked me if he was a fascist. But what could I answer to them? And it's true. No, it's not the completion. I think there is one area where the memory of war and the memory of terror coexist and do not run counter one another, and that is the Russian culture, Russian literature, and Russian films. I already mentioned some of books, and I would can very well think of great films about World War II or the Great Patriotic War, and the culture is always can always enrich itself with tragedies, but it's not embedded into the public minds. Thank you. Dear colleagues, we have another 30 minutes for Q&A and discussions. Timothy, please start. I'm Timothy Grigoryuk from Yaroslavl. Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. I teach history myself, and I always encounter situations that when Soviet stereotypes appear in our history. Just a couple of illustrations from textbooks on history that I have to use. One of the history textbooks in the section on perestroika reads that perestroika won in the Soviet Union thanks to the support of the corrupted elite, which was afraid that the country would return to the tough practices that used to be under Stalin. And the edition of history textbook of 2013 contains a lot of stereotypes, not about the Soviet Union, but its rival United States. So in the section on international relations, it reads how badly, how poorly Red Indians live in their reservations. It also reads about the Mexicans who cannot speak their language in courts. And there is reference to picture 24 that carries the photograph of 1930s, and they are Ku Klux Klan members carrying crosses and flames, lynching black people. So those are the stereotypes that are being reproduced continuously in the official textbooks and the official history, and they have a great impact on the way people's minds are shaped. And it's next to impossible to change the situation unless the state policy changes.
All right, you can make it up for one class. Vadim Korostelyov from Moscow Helsinki Group. I would like to remind you of the Civic Forum of 2001 and the presidential staff. The staff of President Putin wanted to build up this council in such a way that the participants would stand to the anthem and the president would come in, and the forum would start. And if I remember it right, with the support of the Memorial Society, you said that would you not be ashamed if not everybody in the hall would stand up? Upon that, the presidential staff decided to lower the risks, and the president entered under the fanfare. So there was no anthem. So talking of the resistance, how ready do you think, how prepared are the people to resist the seeping in of totalitarianism in the pores of the society? Well, our experts usually collect several questions, and thank you. Timur Zhakhov. I come from Ingushetia. I would like to share with you some information that among the Ingush people there are very sensitive memories of the deportation of the Ingush people in 1944, and these events were more terrible, that the deportations usually took place on some state holidays or public holidays, and this was done in almost an ideological way. And the compensation, the English people were paid by 8,000 rubles for every deported family, or the descendants of every deported family. And there's even a version about the deportation of the Chechen and the Ingush people. Originally, it was planned that only the Chechens needed to be deported, and then they decided to do both the Chechens and the Ingush people. As a result, two peoples were deported, and throughout the years of deportation, the number of our peoples fell almost twofold. In 1991, the rehabilitation law was adopted, and the territorial rehabilitation was also given a mention, and this clause led to some tragic events in the autumn of 1992 and the interethnic conflict in. Eventually, the law was reverted to the Constitutional Court, but another bomb was set in, whereby these questions were to be solved at the consent of both parties. Question from Sochi. Anna Martinova from Sochi. We have spoken about the territory and memory. I was born in 1980, but both of these aspects are very important because the memory of the war is indelibly related to the memory of terror. In 1942, in Maikop, a 19-year-old soldier of Wehrmacht, Johann, saved the grandmother of my husband and her family. And this German soldier was killed in Maikop at the age of 19. In Zaporozhye, my grandfather was perished in Gulag, and my father was born in 6 months after his death. Which of these events will be reflected in the unified history textbook, which is being prepared for publication. Anton Khvastov from Saratov. Do you believe that in 20 years you will have supporters and followers in the Memorial Foundation? It appears that today's young have very little interest in the history of the repressions and the Soviet terror. This morning we had a presentation by filmmaker Krzysztof Zanussi, and he related to us a story that his father told him that when you go to school, the physics, chemistry and mathematics teachers will tell you the truth, and the geography, history, literature teachers don't rely on their words. Come back home and I will tell them, and will tell you what is right and what is wrong. My boy is 4-year-old. In 7 years, when I have to have a conversation with him like that, what am I expected to tell him? These are very difficult questions. Denis Grekov from the Altai region. Well, first of all, let me tell you that in Barnaul, when a trade center was and there were Kolchak time graves which were found in our region. Now, as to the textbook of history, the authors could not emigrate and decided to go for collaboration. What can you say about the ministers of culture, the Minister of Culture of this country, who said not long ago that some digressions from the truth are quite plausible and acceptable for the interests of the state? All right, let us have this series of questions. If we have more time, we will have more questions. I will be very brief, starting from the end. Well, with respect to this Minister of Culture, I have to tell you, I have survived many ministers of culture, but sometimes Russia is not particularly lucky. It appears that Russia is not very lucky with this minister. Unfortunately, he is also a writer. You can read some of his books. What are we to say? Concerning the history teachers, this thought that Krzysztof Zanussi shared, this is exactly the principle I adhered to throughout my school years. I knew that the only newspaper that I should read is the Soviet Sports. Because if this newspaper says that the men ran for 100 meters for 10.2 seconds, then this would be true. And that one football club won in the game 2-0, then this would also be true. But it appeared that the only way where to know the truth from the newspapers or the printed sources were about the sports magazines. Concerning your son, the situation is very different today. Irrespective of this Minister of Culture, in spite of this Minister of Education, in spite of the Russian Historical Society, which is creating concocting some sort of a history textbook, and the very fact that it is a unified history textbook, it is already bad by definition. But in this country, we have a huge number, thousands upon thousands of great teachers, history teachers. I'm also a school teacher, and I know this feeling. I remember these feelings in the Soviet times. So when you go into the class, close the door behind you, and you're free. And these teachers, there are quite a few teachers in different places, and it is our great luck. It is our fortune to have such people, as long as they're still in position. But I have to tell you that it is not particularly prestigious to be a teacher today. So try to find such schools where they would have such textbooks, because the good teachers and the parents run around the schools and they talk to teachers. Who knows if there are going to be followers in 20 years? Who knows what's going to happen? Did I think 10 years ago that I would live to see today's delirium? This delirium which is poured on me from the TV screens when some great museums are closed down, the NGOs. Did I think maybe in 20 years everything would be different? I don't know. I have no idea what will happen in 20 years, if there will be followers. God knows. Well, on the law of rehabilitated peoples, I've always been against this law, because from the legal standpoint, even before this law, there were very important legal norms which were adopted, and that indeed confirmed that these terrorist acts against whole peoples were illegal. Individual rehabilitation was not meant because people were rehabilitated according to the law of the victims of political repressions. So indeed, this law had a very principle view of this rehabilitation. This was there was indeed the problem of the Prigorodny district between Ossetia and Ingushetia. These were deported, others came into this house, and it came to be under the jurisdiction of a different republic. 50 years had passed, and this is not the only problem. This territorial dispute. You have to realize that this was a de facto, a problem that could not be de facto solved. There was no mechanism, as there is no mechanism today to solve this. There is no mechanism, alas, to solve this problem, this conflict. I think that the law that was adopted in the way it was can only be regarded as a mine. We remember this war. I remember I was there. We spoke a lot about this with Ruslan Surtalovich, who was the head of the Gush Republic, Mr. Aushov, a very talented man. With respect to the compensation of 8,000 rubles, this was then the compensation is for the lost property, which is up to 10,000 rubles if a house was lost. Up until today, people showed documents about huge houses from the 19th century, and they tried never to pay the 10,000, so they paid 8,000 in Ingush Republic. Talking of the resistance, if people are ready or are prepared for resistance, I would rather defer on Alexander Yurievich. You are the people. You are the people, and each one of you must ask yourself, what are you more prepared for, resistance or a compromise? Or resistance and compromise? What is the limit of concession that you can go for? And here we will start by thinking twice. We think that resistance, sometimes it's contagious, like a bacillus. But in essence, that layer that you belong to, 30-year-old intellectuals, I think this is also an individual subject for every one of you. I will get back to it. Arseny Borisovich has answered all questions, and I can only agree with his answers, which is certainly not a surprise, because we've been together for about 100 years as partners and colleagues. But just a couple of remarks to the question of the Minister of Culture, who, as he remembered, is also un littérateur. I have, not being peevish, I have read his novels, but I can say that when Smolensk was sieged, one boyar was saluting another boyar by giving him a military salute. You know, then what are we supposed to talk about with such kind of a Minister of Culture? With respect to history, I can only add that for the Memorial Society, history teachers are. It's not a client group. It is our reserve. These are our clients. These are our customers, indeed, our patrons, and many of the memorial organizations in the regions of Russia very often comprise history teachers, which is indeed the main vanguard of our civil society. And there are people who take children for tours and they show them the places related to the tragic history. They conduct forums and seminars. I've seen quite a few remarkable personalities, but who would dare dismissing these people? But this, of course, is the case for now. We don't know if this continues to be the case. I do not know if Memorial will have followers in 20 years, but the one thing I could say is that we have been alive. We have for about 12 years. We have conducted the high school students' works, almost 35,000 works over the past 12 years. And many of these works may well be called the works of our followers, and they, when they wrote these, they were 15 to 16 years of age. On the Anna Martinova's told about the German soldier who had saved her husband's, your husband's grandmother. Well, this is indeed the question to the unified history textbook and the regionalization of history teaching. If any good teacher in the city of Sochi must indeed pick up these stories and take them down to their students, then they would stay in the canvas of history. With respect to the law on the deported peoples, the only thing I could add is the reminiscence by Sergei Adamovich Kovalyov, who was the head of the Supreme Council. Deputy head of the Council, of the Supreme Council, and when this law was discussed, he, as the member of the Presidium of the Supreme Council, he came to me. I said to Hasbulatov, this law smells of blood, and indeed, in a year, the conflict started in the Prigorodny district. So much now, I can't say anything about the resistance. All right, we can have another 5 questions and we will end at this. My lady. Irina Zhuravlyova from St. Petersburg. What do you think will be the historical memory of the new generation which will read the chapter about the Crimean crisis? And how will it reflect on our history? Mr. Filatov. He has a word at every session. Artyom Filatov from St. Petersburg. You spoke about the historical memory. On Monday, we had the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. Moscow is now sending out the designs for the monuments, and in Pskov there is an interesting precedent. They wanted to erect the monument to a local officer. I think Kotlyarevsky was the name of this officer who led the assault. And there's a very interesting local story. Instead, Moscow imposes upon the local authorities and the local society some very generalized images. And while we're talking about the Second World War through the prism of some official state policies, what precludes such the regions to try and be more independent in commemorating the memory of the First World War? Ruslan Tsarev from Kostroma. 2 short remarks. I was born, raised, and studied in Kharkov, and I was born in 1973 and graduated from a Soviet school. And I knew that I learned that Bandera was in the concentration camp, the German concentration camp. I only learned about this at the Ukrainian university, and talking of the monuments to the military leaders, I've recently heard 2 news. In the Buйsk region, because there was no money to repair the monument to the victims of the World War II. One pensioner paid for about 50 to 100,000 rubles out of her own money. In another region, there was no money at all to commemorate the victims of the war. Alexandra Azarkina from the Ukraine. In my country, we are seeing that history comes back alive with vengeance, and one of the most contradictory assessments is the assessment of the Soviet past, whereas one part of the country entered the Soviet reality in 1922 and the other part entered the Soviet reality in 1939. So one of the strategies of the Kiev government is now to allow the regions greater independence in commemorating and indeed registering the history that they find more plausible.
Okay, it is too late and we are all tired, so that would be it. Now answers, please. As to the historic memory, and I'm responding to Irina Zhuravleva, would be written in the new textbook with the Crimea, about the Crimea generation. I don't think there would be any historic memory because children today do not pay attention to what is written in the textbooks, and that makes life easier. But there are very good teachers and there are other teachers who prefer to deal with textbooks. Probably they should be given some extra or other sources, and that would be the task of the society in general. Now, memory of the First World War and standard monuments, why they are standard, asks Artyom Filatov from St. Petersburg. I don't know. Maybe it's a trend to unification. Maybe they're afraid that if in Yaroslavl the monument will be different from Kostroma, Yaroslav Oblast would separate itself from Russia. I don't know. As to what Ruslan Tsarev said, it was not a question. It was rather a statement. Right. This is a tricky question about typical standard monument. No memory of the World War I is not there. It was poisoned during all the Soviet years, and people were not interested in it in the post-Soviet time. Now you have to do something. So they invented a certain jubilee. Medinsky and people like him, they have a big problem. They have to celebrate jubilees to consolidate mass conscience, to legitimize the power. And so what are the jubilees? What jubilee is in store for us? August 23 of this year, pretty soon. 75 years of Ribbentrop and Molotov Pact. It's not a small celebration. This specified in the destiny of Europe, and then the September 1, at the beginning of the World War 1, and then 17th September. What is the jubilee there? It's a very horrible word, a liberation of Ukrainian and Belarusian people from the yoke of Polish. So we entered the same the World War, which started on the 1st, and it is clear what side we enter it. Quite recently there came a law on rehabilitation. Now it is prohibited to criticize any activity taken in this period. The law is organized in a way that nobody ever speaks about this law of September 17th. So they have to make a jubilee, and we actually participated in the World War I, but there is no memory, and of course regions have no idea about the World War I, so they put down this issue in the hope that everyone would do the same thing and everybody would consider this in the same way. What about Kiev? In your country, there are so many awful drawbacks as a state, but there is one positive thing. After 91, how many presidents were there? 4, it seems to me, or 5 even. And the Ukraine was a very thin fabric, and it consists of different pieces. But you cannot make Lvov out of Donetsk and make Chernigov out of Donetsk and mix Ivanovo-Frankivsk with Zaporozhye. This is a very special country, and that is how it survives, because it is multi-sided and multicultural country, and there is a difference in memory, and all these different presidents, there are difference among them. They were awful guys, but they didn't try to unify the country, understanding that it was not possible. It's a very interesting story. They knew that you could not unify the Ukraine. But in our country, one monument to 85 regions, and it would be placed in Sebastopol and Simferopol, in St. Petersburg, and here and there. And this is really surprising. And they say that Russia today demands federalization from the Ukraine. It sounds pretty comic, because in our case, federalization is imitational, and Ukraine is the unitary state, but it is regionalized. It's very different, and it is organized in a different way. So it's good that each region places its own monuments. I may envy them. So what it's about? They are for two forces, and we are for multi-sidedness. They are about simplicity, and we are about complicity. The only monument to Trotsky is there in Nikolaev or in Kherson. There is a song by Vysotsky, The Story of Disease, and it ends with the following lines. You should not be upset. Quiet is better for you, because the history of our country is the history of your disease. These two wonderful persons make me feel admiration, and we meet every year for a long time, and what they do and how they do it and they never think that they would get a positive result in the end. These are heroic people, and let us applaud them.
Коллеги, важное объявление. Мы завтра начинаем наше федералистское утро в половине 10.
9:30. Tomorrow it's 9:30, in line with the program, 9:30.